What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today's video is from the line. We're going to be hearing from a caller that's decided to call in and try to prove either God to us or some other kind of crazy idea. So, if you want to fuck around and find out how crazy this call gets, then please stay tuned.
Anthony, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Tell us a little, welcome to Skep Talk, and tell us a little bit about your question.
Yeah, Eric, on May 13th, you were on Skep Talk, and an atheist caller or someone was speaking to you and was trying to present an argument for determinism and how it's basically more scientifically valid than the idea of free will. And you were pretty much agreeing with a lot of what that person was saying. I kind of wanted to play off of that conversation and explore that concept, because it seems to me like any argument against free will is self-defeating and scientifically just wrong. So, and John, obviously, whatever thoughts you have as well, but that's kind of what I wanted to explore. Like,
yeah, that's
why does determinism seem more likely and scientific to you?
That's an awesome question. So most of what I know about this conversation comes from, and I believe I mentioned this on that call as well, comes from the work of Robert Sapolsky, who's done quite a bit of neurology, and then he's also a primatologist. So that's how I got my introduction to him. I've read his text Behave, which is quite good and includes a little bit about the determinism, free will conversation. But at the same time, he has this other book called Determined that specifically tackles that issue, and I've not read it yet. It's not even on my shelf. Because to me, the conversation, while interesting, kind of falls to the wayside in comparison to other conversations that I tend to prefer having. My opinion on it, as a result, is not as informed as I would like it to be, but I can tell you where I come from now, like my perspective as of right now. To me, free will is something that doesn't seem to be tangible or empirical. It's not something that we seem to be able to measure. And all the neurology that comes out of this topic seems to suggest that we are, not to sound too like gray on it, but more or less extremely complicated response stimulus machines. Does that mean that free will is like definitely not a thing? No, I wouldn't put myself in that category. I would say I don't think it's likely, because my understanding is that from a lot of the neurology, when we are presented with various stimuli and various questions, choices in our lives, we tend to make decisions that are fully informed by every prior experience combined with our predispositions in our genetics and our anatomy and things of that nature. I see no reason to suppose, given that, and I believe there's been some studies as well that show that when we make decisions, the brain sort of fires in our motor regions before it sort of clicks in our frontal lobes, for lack of a better term. I'm no neurologist, but the idea is that when I choose to pick up my White Claw, my brain fires the motor neurons to pick up the White Claw before it occurs to me that I'm about to pick up the White Claw. So to me, that suggests that if there is a type of free will going on, it's something that is so utterly intangible that my conscious self can't recognize it. And it's something that doesn't appear to be at present measurable. And so I am inclined to doubt that it exists.
John, do you have any thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts going on. So I guess I try to think of things in, I guess, simplistic terms, especially when it comes to areas outside of my expertise. And the way that I've always seen like free will versus determinism is like with free will, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that you're talking about like absolute free will, right? Like for every decision that I make, I have the ability to choose any like any decision that could conceivably exist. I have that at my fingertips to choose, correct?
Yeah, I guess the way the philosophers kind of put it is you can choose otherwise, or in my perspective, the future is indeterminate. So whenever you arrive at a point in time or a moment, yeah, your course is not set. So you can go one way or the other. Okay, yeah.
Right. I was just trying to make sure that I was talking about how you felt about free will, and it seems like I was at least correctly describing what you think. And I really can't square that with my own experience. Now, could there be somebody out there that like has the ability to foresee every single choice that exists for any particular decision? I'm not going to rule that out necessarily, but I feel like for any one person making a decision, you have a curated list of decisions to make, and then you have the ability to decide between those two, or not two, but those however many present to you. But the curated list that your mind, I guess, presents to you as options for what you can do, that's just an incredibly small amount of decisions that could be made. And I'll give you an example. If and I actually had a Mormon one time. I said this yesterday on the show. I had 2 Mormons come to my house at one point, and they came back 3 times because they just couldn't penetrate my skepticism. But I posed the question to him like this: if I go and I knock on your door, do you have the capability to shoot me in the face like immediately upon opening the door? And I'll pose that question to you here now. If I knock on your door, do you have it in you without any kind of context or any kind of consideration about who I might be or what I might be there asking for or whatever? Do you think that you would just immediately pull out a gun and shoot me in the face?
I would not do that. Given not having any other, I wouldn't do that.
Okay. Do you think, like, whenever you open the door to somebody, does that ever occur to you to just pull out a gun and shoot a person in the face?
No, I've never thought that when someone knocks on my door and I don't know who they are to this point.
Okay. So, I mean, just using this basic example here, I guess, I feel like not everybody has all of the options available to them, because one, not only does it not present to you to shoot the person in the face, but also I feel like I get the feeling from our limited interaction here that that's just not something that you could do. Like, that's just not part of your character. Am I correct in that assessment there?
I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I'm not going to kill a random person who knocks on my door. Just so I don't freak out the audience at the very least.
Oh, okay.
Excuse me a minute.
Yes, let's
excuse me a minute. Erica, could you please check Discord?
Sure we can.
So it seems to me, if I could just make a few comments here. You actually are affirming, like I do, that the future is indeterminate, but that the range of options is possibly slightly more restricted or limited than what I would possibly affirm. But at the same time, that seems to be, it's still in conflict with the scientific, materialistic paradigm, which says that there's only one possible future.
No. So I disagree with that assessment of like how I feel about it, because I was just handling whether or not free will exists in that particular situation. Now, as far as determinism goes, I've actually had to think about this quite recently, because I believe it was Jimmy Snow that was like, he just asked me about it, and I just had to really sit there and ponder about it for a while. And I feel like if we think of reality as like a system, and you input the reality, takes inputs and it has outputs that goes into the next situation or next instance or whatever, not of reality, but like in moments or whatnot. If we were to rewind today, right, to the beginning of the day, had all the exact same inputs, I would make the exact same decisions that I made today. Like, there's nothing that I would change. How could I change anything about today, any decision that I made today, if all of the inputs going into this block that we're calling today how can I make a different decision? Like, how could that reasonably change if all of the inputs are the same? I mean, that's like asking if you have like two AND gates, welded, or not welded, but I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm a computer engineer. If you had two AND gates connected together and you put inputs into that particular system, are you going to have different outputs depending on what time every time you run the test? Are you going to have different outputs to the system, or is it always going to be the same?
So before really quick, so sorry to interrupt. Anthony, you are crackling like super badly. Is there a chance you could try? I'm not sure what's causing the crackling, or do two things for me. One, make sure you're not on speakerphone, and two, pull back from your mic, like maybe about 6 inches or something like that. I just want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep you from crackling, because if the crackling gets too bad, then we're going to have to discuss your question without you able to respond, like take you off the call. And I don't want to do that.
Let me try. Is this any better?
That is significantly better. Yes.
Okay. All right. Let me try to keep it like this then.
Yeah. However you're currently doing it, keep it that way. You're good.
Okay. Well, okay. So responding to John about the inputs, I guess the point about free will is that what determines what you do, the ultimate input is your mind, your will. So your mind is substantive.
Right. And sorry to interrupt. And I understand what you're saying here. Let's shrink down this system that I'm talking about to just being your mind, right? Let's shrink it down to that. If all of the same inputs are applied to whatever decision you make, like whatever life experiences you have up until X point in your life, you have those inputs to your system, and then there's going to be an output. How does that change? You're talking about, I guess it really kind of depends on how you view minds in general, because I don't think minds are magical. I think minds are chemical machines. They react to certain stimuli, like Erica was saying earlier. So given if all of the stimuli that work into certain point X in your life are the exact same going in, no matter how many times you rewind the clock back to the beginning of that situation, how does your brain operate differently than it already has, before you rewound the clock?
Okay,
like,
so
are there any other?
Well, first of all, what you did was you conflated brain and mind, which to me they're different things. So that's the first thing I would like to say. But yeah, so your mind makes its decision based on the input. So to give an example, let's say you come to a fork in the road and you don't know which one leads where. So your mind has no reason to choose one or the other. But if someone tells you, that there's a cliff at the end of one of them beforehand and you're going to go off of it, then you're going to choose the other one. But the point is, you could have chosen either one based on all of your prior knowledge and experiences. When you arrive at that fork in the road, you can't actually choose one or the other, but you are going to make your decision based on what the content of your mind. So your mind is what determines.
If I may here, right, like this is sort of where the crux of the issue is, right? Like we have a fundamental difference here in the fact that the mind and the brain are conflated or they're not. Either they're the same thing or they aren't. And my position on free will, versus determinism, which again, I tried to show is informed at least by what we can tell are like relatively objective empirical studies, right? My brain fires for me to pick something up before I realize that's what I'm doing. It's a fraction of a second, but that does seem to be what's going on. If the mind and the brain are one and the same, then that experiment in and of itself provides a lot of reason to doubt that free will is something that exists. It provides a lot of reason to doubt that we are not simply the product, not so simply, I mean, it's incredibly complicated and rich, right? But that we are not the product of our experiences, our genetics, our hormones, and so on and so forth, and how we interact with others around us. So what I'm saying here is that it seems that the issue isn't so much free will versus determinism, it's body mind, it's dualism. Like, can you support the notion that the mind is something that's separate from the body? And that's a completely different conversation, I think, than the one about free will. Do you think it's fair to say that if the body and mind, if the brain and the mind are one and the same, there isn't a case to be made for free will? Would it be fair enough, do you think, to say that at this point?
I agree. Yeah, it does come down to whether if the brain equals mind, then there is no free will. I agree with that.
Okay, so then I think that what we need to do is move the conversation a little bit here to dualism. Like, can we show or can we not show that the body and the mind are one and the same? And to sort of offer my position on it, it's exactly the same as the free will versus determinism conversation. Is it impossible that there is some sort of a ethereal quality to the mind, that there's a spirit or a soul or whatever? I don't think it's impossible. I'm pretty friendly to the idea of it, to being open-minded to it. But the reason why I don't believe in it is because I don't think that there's currently evidence to support the notion, which I would be interested in what you can provide here. As far as I can tell, we are what our brains are. We are our brains. It's a classic example, but usually what people go to is like Phineas Gage, like wholesale personality changes because you mess with the gray matter, you mess with the white matter, you screw up the brain, and the person isn't the same. It seems to be that their personality, what makes them, is radically altered when you screw with what's in their skull. And so I'm going to go ahead and quickly punt it to John to see what he thinks about that, and then back to you, Anthony, to see what you think about it. Keep in mind, stay far away. Do whatever you were doing before, because you were crackling again a little bit just recently. And I really like this conversation. I want to keep you on the call. So go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to question, like, considering that we have a lot of medical studies and I guess case studies and all that show how if you alter a person's mind, that their personalities can change. And even so I'm a diabetic, and when my sugar gets incredibly low, I'm talking like 25 blood glucose points. It's like milliliters per or milligrams per deciliter. Like when it gets low like that, like I'm a dick. Right. But I mean, that's because my chemistry is messed up. Right. Like that's that happens to me. But it's because of my low blood sugar that, I have these kind of mood swings and everything like that. So, I mean, that just as simple as that shows that, your being can change depending on your current biochemistry. But also, if the brain is damaged, you can see changes in people's personalities. The Phineas Gage case is a pretty good example. There's several other cases where people's brains have been damaged, or like they've suffered some kind of brain damage, not like physical damage to the brain, but some kind of brain damage that they've suffered, and their personalities change. Oh, it's a fictional movie, obviously. But it's an older movie, so that might not appeal to some people. But there's this Harrison Ford movie called Regarding Henry, and in that movie he ends up getting shot in the head, right? And his entire personality changes. Of course, he's got to relearn how to do everything, right? But the fact is that like he was like this really top 1%er asshole kind of guy, and then he's immediately turns around and he's like the best guy ever, right? And this is it's a fictional story and anecdotal and everything like that, but I mean, I do feel like it's based on pretty solid evidence that if your brain is damaged, your personality can change. So my question, get all of this to get to the question, why does that happen on your view, that somebody's personality would change? And also, what part of a person's brain seems to be magical, or what part of a person's brain is magical? Because I feel like, and maybe that's a bit of a derogatory way of referencing it, but I'm just saying, like, what part of a person's brain is supernatural enough to where it exists independent of your physical brain?
All right. So there were a number. Basically, there was one main question, but a number of points made. First of all, is my audio coming in fine, or do I need to do something?
No, you're perfect.
You're fine right now.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say I do think that this question weighs in on the general atheism versus theism debate, because if the mind is independent of the physical brain, it would prove to me that there is something beyond the physical realm, which is nevertheless substantively real, which is beyond the means of science to investigate, which I think would, at the very least, support the theistic position. But to respond to some of your points, Erica, you did mention a study which shows that scientists can measure the brain firing before any physical action takes place. And I'm aware of that, and it is true. But in my model, the reason that happens is because when the mind sends the signal to the brain, it takes a short amount of time for that signal to reach the nerves. But let's say they want you to push a button. They can actually measure the amount of time it takes for a signal to get from the brain to the finger. And it's a very small amount of time. It's a fraction of a second, but nevertheless, it's measurable. So
Right.
in my model, the mind initiates the signal in the brain, which is at that point measurable, and then only a fraction of a second later does your finger move to push the button. So that's how my model would account for those experiments. Now, as for the general question of why there's any reason to believe the mind is separate from the brain, is first of all, because if you examine the physical components of the brain at a microscopic level, I see no basis for an origin for a thought or what are called kalia. If you look at the atoms of the brain, they are protons, neutrons, and electrons, and subatomic particles like that. How does science get from that to a field of consciousness in the mind and things like thoughts and desires? So I don't see when you look at the physical structure of the brain, the chemical structure of the brain, at the most basic level, I don't see a scientific basis by which a mind can exist in those physical structures.
So I think I know John wanted to say something here, so I'm going to boot it to him really quickly because I have something longer that I want to say, and I don't want to monologue here. But first, I think again I want to make sure we're being clear with our terms here, make sure that I'm understanding and not strawmanning you. So the mind, you have the mind as divorced from the brain, and then you have consciousness as something that is effectively the mind. Would that be a fair characterization?
Basically, yes.
Okay, so I would argue, and I'm going to boot it to John here in a second and then kind of elaborate on this thought here in a minute, but I would argue that consciousness is an emergent property of our own neurobiology, and I would argue that it is one that is incredibly important with regard to being able to survive and thrive. It actually is pivotal for increasing fitness. And then the sort of tertiary thing I would add to that is I would argue that it's something that is a gradient. It's not something that exists in humans alone, but exists to varying degrees in most of the animal kingdom, and depending on who you talk to, perhaps even extending into other kingdoms of life. So I'll elaborate on that in a second, but John, I know you wanted to say something a minute ago, so go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask real quickly, because in your explanation there, you were like, the mind sends a signal to the brain, and then the brain sends a signal to your finger. I feel like there's a bit of an ad hoc assumption that's worked in there about, the mind being, separate from the brain. I'm just wondering how do you, and I don't know, maybe your previous statements have already stated the evidence for this, but what evidence do you have that it's not just like your brain, because we have different parts to our brain, right? Like there's the, maybe Erica can help me out with the exact way to say it, but there's the autonomic nervous system. It works automatically. So there are these signals that operate, that work without you having to think about it. So like your heart beating, nails growing, whatever in the hell, like your digestion, like you don't have to consciously think about those things. So what's the evidence that says, oh, well, it's definitely this separate entity that we're calling the mind, and not just some other part of the brain that starts the signal, sending it, throughout the brain, and then the brain transmits it through your nerves to your finger, which is what that delay is that going from your physical brain to your finger. It's not like there's an extra magical step in there where there's some kind of wireless Bluetooth connection between what we're calling mind and your physical brain, right? So it's just your brain sending the signal. I'm just wondering, how do you determine that it's not just the brain sending signals? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do. Well, let me try and answer this. First of all, the experience that humans have is that we are making choices. So to say that we aren't actually making choices and it's just an emergent phenomenon, to me, is not based on observations, but rather presupposition, materialistic. But I'm going to answer your question. Let me get to it. It's logically necessary that the mind, the decision, come before the physical interaction. Otherwise, I can't. If you're going to say humans are deciding to do things, then you can't just say it's a response to stimuli. The decision must be initiated outside of the physical body, because basically otherwise all your body is doing is operating according to natural laws, and your mind or your brain is just basically operating in like a water flowing downhill. It can't change its course. But
Right.
if I make a decision,
that's not even true for water. I mean, that's not even true for water. I mean, have you seen those time lapses of how rivers change? I mean, water flows and rivers change all the time. So, I mean, I feel like that's a bad example.
That's entirely accountable by physical mechanisms. There's erosion.
Right.
Exactly what I'm fucking talking about, though.
Yeah. So I
basically.
Sorry. If I may, I want to hear the rest of what you're saying. So finish. I want to hear you finish your thought, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah. So basically, for a human to actually be making a choice, which is what appears is what's happening, the mind must take precedent over the physical, or what we observe as the physical, because otherwise the choice is an illusion. But it doesn't appear to be an illusion. It seems like we really are making choices, but under the materialistic model, these choices are merely illusions and there's no basis for them in the physical, the brain.
So it's a tough sort of concept to wrap your head around, and it's indeed quite vast. It's like considering the size of the universe, right? But I would argue that choice, it is kind of an illusion, right? And we are the sort of product of all of these experiences that we have, down to the indecision that we exhibit, right? So my experience, right? I love vanilla ice cream. I love chocolate ice cream. I think they're both good. If I could pick between the two, it's going to depend on the day that I'm being asked. I'm not a solid preference giver for that. And the reason for that is because I've had really good experiences in my past with vanilla ice cream and with chocolate ice cream. And there's probably an element too that plays into my genetics, where both my parents like both of them as well. So when I'm up at the counter and I'm trying to decide between vanilla and chocolate, I keep wanting to switch to strawberry because that's actually, I prefer that to the two of them. But what I end up choosing is going to entirely come down to exposures that I've had over that day and over the past several, weeks and years that I am unaware of. I am not consciously accessing them. So when I'm sitting at the table or sitting at the counter, I'm like, do I want vanilla? Do I want chocolate? Well, maybe I picked chocolate last time, so now I want vanilla. Or maybe for lunch yesterday, I had something that was had a vanilla bean sort of flavor to it, and so that pushes me towards chocolate, right? There are all of these different minute experiences that I have across my life that will influence the decision that I'm about to make. But it's no more a decision than natural selection is nature actively selecting. It is a filter that influences what I'm going to do eventually. And I think that it's quite analogous to some of these complex neural networks that we try to create that are complex and rich and beautiful and wonderful, but nevertheless, they will give a certain output with a given input. And so I don't find that to be, alarming or distressing. And I'm not discounting the possibility that there is something external to that at play. What I'm arguing is that in the same way that you might say you're presupposing something natural, I would turn around and say, I'm not presupposing it. I'm pointing to the neuroscience that in the same way when John gave the example of the river changing course, you responded with, no, we can account for all of that naturally. I point to the neuroscience that I mentioned earlier and say, we can account for the decisions that we make naturally, conventionally speaking. Consciousness seems to be this aspect of our reality that is ethereal and difficult to quantify. And I don't deny that. The mystery of consciousness, I think, still exists in science, although I think there are some wonderful hypotheses that exist to explain it. And one of them very well might be the case. I have a favorite myself. But I would propose that consciousness is emergent from the neural networks of our brains in the same way that a river is emergent of the water molecules that are clashing together against one another because they meet, because they fell from a rainstorm and conglomerated in an area and they're in a slight decline. So they start moving down and there's heterogeneity in the sediment. And so they end up carving this very specific path that ultimately was laid out by the geology of the earth millions of years beforehand. And to think otherwise, from my perspective, requires for you to present something that is not explainable by natural means within consciousness, within neurobiology, within gross anatomy and physiology of the brain, that is, I would argue, profound. It would need to be a profound example of something that can't be explained. That's where I'm coming from on this stuff.
Donna, do you have any thoughts? Or well, let me respond to that. Okay, go ahead. I guess.
No, I was just gonna say no. I'm interested in in what you have to say.
Well, Erica, that was that was quite eloquent. But I want to go back to basically what you said right at the beginning, which you did affirm that you think ultimately the choice is an illusion. And what I'm trying to say is, if we just ignore all the philosophy, ignore all the complicated neuroscience, and just go by our everyday experience, it does actually seem at a most basic level, apparent level, that our choices are real. So if that is the case, and I think anyone claiming otherwise is the one making the extraordinary claim, how could you possibly account for real choices, and they appear to be real to me, with a purely materialistic model where consciousness is an emergent property of the brain? And I just haven't seen that done to my satisfaction. And I was kind of, I guess it comes down to, if our choices are real and we really are choosing as it appears to be, then I don't see how materialism, with its kind of set pathway for physical matter, can account for humans choosing to go one way or the other. You see what I'm saying there?
I totally do. And in a brief response, again, what I'm arguing here is that it absolutely feels like a choice. It feels like it, but it's not. And the reason is because when you simplify it, when you go down to simple neural networks or simple organisms that do seem to choose, their choice is, in essence, the end terminus, the current end terminus of all of their experiences, their hormones, and their genetics. So from my perspective, it's difficult to tie down in humans and in other highly cognitive animals like other apes or cetaceans or corvids or proboscideans or whatever, right? Because our neural networks are so intense, but nonetheless, we can't seem to point to something that is truly ethereal. We can point to choice and say it feels like a choice, but it seems like a choice when I observe a flatworm to take one route over the other in its little aquarium. But I don't think that flatworm has an external mind that's telling it to do one thing over the other. And there have been some interesting studies with slime molds as well that seem to point to that as an explanation. Again, I think it's a bit of an impasse because you're incredulous that your experiences could be the end product of something that is so sort of empirical isn't the word, something that is so almost like response stimulus, something that feels more robotic to you, because it doesn't feel robotic when we make choices. It feels informed and rich and wonderful and elegant, right? But I would argue that there's in the same way that you might say there's no reason to think that it's empirical. I would point to these experiments that seem to imply that it is. I haven't seen anything yet other than you saying it feels like a choice, which I agree with, that supports that it's a choice. Like I wish I could trust my anecdotal experience the way that you do, but when I look outside, the Earth also seems flat, right? When I look at the horizon, I don't see the curve because I'm on the surface of the Earth. That doesn't mean the Earth isn't curved. It just means I'm not at the right vantage point to appreciate it. And this kind of thing happens all the time in science. So that's my story. Again, we might be at an impasse here. And I'm not going to sit here and say, no, there's no shot. We'll never find any evidence for dualism or a soul or something external to the brain. What I'm saying is at present, if we look strictly at the empirical, as I like to do, it doesn't seem that way. And that's why I'm inclined to be a determinist.
Yeah, and I agree with what Erica said right there, and also I feel like we're at an impasse too, because I don't see a need to introduce a supernatural element to our brains. I don't understand how we would actually be able to test for that or be able to know that this supernatural aspect of it exists. I know that you claim that, you know, the ability to choose is a sign of some kind of like independence of mind from body, but I don't understand why that makes more sense, because just having the ability to choose does not necessarily denote some kind of like, you know, I guess mind independent of the body. I mean, you know, the animals at every single level make decisions like that. Like, I don't know if you consider all animals everywhere to have this sort of supernatural mind aspect to them. Even the ones that are just run off of basic instinct that you know, just react, you know, without any kind of higher cognitive function. You know, I guess I just don't see the ability to make decisions as the determining factor for any kind of mind independence. And I feel like that's where we're at an impasse. You believe in the magical version of mind, and I believe in the emergent property that we call the mind.
Okay, well, we can leave it there. Yeah, I mean, I would like to respond, but I know I've been on the line for a long time, so I'm going to yield to other callers. But maybe that's a point of discussion for future is whether purely materialistic models can account for real choices. So, Sarah, thank you for taking my call.
Yeah, I wish I had this. Normally, I'm pretty good at having the study on hand. I tried to look it up while I was sitting here, but my attention was kind of split. Next time, I'll be better prepared. I guess I'm going to have to buy Determined, because this question has come up enough times that I think it's time that I actually got like super informed on the opinion that I'm holding here, which, you know, I think it's not as informed as I'd like it to be, and put it that way. But thank you for the stimulating call. That was a good conversation, and I hope you call back.
All right, thank you. Have a good day. Or whatever.
Take care. You too. All right. I thought that was a good call. I really enjoyed that. It's like, yeah, you know, you kind of hit the nail on the head, where it's like you get asked this kind of question, and you're like, ah, crap. Like, why do I feel the way that I do? Why do I feel like I'm a determinist? Or like, you know, that happens to me constantly, where it's like I hold this position, but I'm like, I need to sit and dissect why I actually think the way that I think.
Right. Yeah. And actually, when Jimmy had first proposed it to me, I really didn't have a good answer for him. I'm like, well, you know, I really don't know. Because, I mean, like, if I haven't really considered something, my first thing to go to is, you know, just, well, I don't know what I think about that. Because it's really hard to, like, carefully consider that kind of thing in the moment. I usually like to take a little bit of time and really consider like what I think about it. So, that's what I did. And, you know, for a lot of these things that are like deeply philosophical and these sort of really complicated topics, I guess in my mind, I try to simplify it down into like, I guess, real world examples that's kind of helps me understand like my position, as well as being able to explain it to other people. So that's why I didn't really go into very many like I guess, technical things about the mind-body problem. I'm very simple in, well, this is my experience. Because of my experience, I simply can't believe in either a magical mind or in like free will, I guess. So I would definitely say that I'm a determinist too.
So it was determined by all your previous experiences, hormones, and genetics, huh? You don't have a choice.
Yeah, no, I agree that any of the decisions that I've made have been a direct, a direct conclusion of my entire life. So, I mean, there's not a single thing, I guess, that I can regret because I don't think that I have the option, to make a different decision.
I'm kind of a bonehead with philosophy stuff, but I think it's, that's why I turn to like studies and stuff like that. Cause it's like, oh, okay. I can point to this, like that makes sense to me. But I tweeted at one point a long time ago, I was like, with the free will debate, functionally, here's how it is for me. It feels like I have free will and I'm happy with that. I don't think I actually do. I think it was probably deterministic. Maybe it's not, but the evidence seems to point to it being deterministic, right? But it feels like I have free will, and I think that's good enough. For me, it's good enough. And maybe that, again, that's my boneheaded anti-philosophy take because I'm allergic to philosophy, but I shouldn't be. I shouldn't be, but I am.
Philosophy a lot of times goes over my head, and honestly, whenever I respond to like Jordan Peterson or somebody, I usually have to go like sentence by sentence and like break down the words that he's saying.
Yeah. Oh no, same for sure. Like a lot of that, and anyways.
Well, heathens, that's going to be it for this call today. If you want more of this kind of content, you can hit up the links down in the description to go and subscribe to The Line here on YouTube. We're always producing great live content where we take callers from people. We're also adding new shows all the time. So please go down there, subscribe to The Line so that you can get more of this kind of content. I'm not sure if this was 20 seconds or anything like that, but yada, yada, yada. Jimmy, go fuck yourself.